It was the early 1830s in Paris. Liszt was an elegant young man and a prodigiously talented virtuoso pianist who was acquainted with the leading figures of the Romantic movement in France. In 1833, at 21 years of age, Liszt met Countess Marie d'Agoult in a Parisian salon. She was 27, unhappily married to an older man, and immediately attracted to Liszt. This is how Marie describes their first encounter in her memoirs. The door opened, and a wonderful apparition struck my eyes. I say an apparition, for I can find no other word for the powerful emotion that stirred me at the sight of the most extraordinary person I had ever seen. And that's how their relationship began. In 1835, Marie left her husband and eloped with Liszt to Geneva. For the next 4 years, the couple lived and traveled together in Switzerland and Italy. Ultimately, though, their relationship would not last. But these years of wandering left a profound impression on Liszt and stimulated him to create one of the greatest masterpieces in 19th century piano music. In 1842, Liszt publishes his Album d'un voyageur, an eclectic collection of 19 pieces mostly inspired by his travels in Switzerland, comprising original compositions, improvisations on themes by other composers, and works based on folk material. Liszt explains his artistic intentions in the foreword to the collection. Having in recent times traveled in many new countries, through different landscapes and places consecrated by history and poetry, having felt that the varied phenomena of nature did not pass before my eyes as empty images, but produced deep emotions in my soul, I have tried to present in music some of my strongest sensations and my most vivid impressions. By the way, the title is probably derived from Lettres d'un voyageur by George Sand, as one of these letters was addressed to Liszt himself. 6 years later, Liszt retired from the concert stage and settled in Weimar, concentrating his energy on composing as well as revising almost all of his major compositions from his virtuoso years. As Alfred Brendel explains, the sometimes chaotic and overwritten music of Liszt's virtuoso years needed to be organized and purified. Invariably, it is the poetic idea of each piece that continues to fire Liszt's musical imagination. In other words, the poetic inspiration remained the same, but Liszt was aiming for greater transparency and structural integrity. 7 pieces from Album d'un voyageur were revised for inclusion in the cycle that came to be known as Année de pèlerinage, Première Année Suisse. 2 more pieces were newly added to the set for a total of 9 pieces. The set was published in 1855. Liszt's revisions of the pieces from Album d'un voyageur ranged from alterations in the surface texture to what essentially amounts to a recomposition of the original version. The title Année de pèlerinage may be inspired by Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre or Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Both these literary works deal with the theme of self-transformation brought about by an extended voyage, a theme that probably resonated strongly with Liszt. Now let's take a closer look at Vallée d'Obermann, which is like a tone poem that lies at the heart of the collection. First, the title does not refer to a particular place in Switzerland. Rather, it is a reference to the early 19th century novel Obermann by the French author Étienne Pivert de Senoncourt. Written in the form of letters, this novel describes the world-weariness and existential angst of a young man who lives in self-imposed exile in the Swiss Alps, searching in vain for a life of meaning and contentment. As Liszt explains to his publisher, the gloomy hyper-elegiac fragment La Vallée d'Obermann, which I have included in the Swiss year of the Année de pèlerinage, since the novel itself also takes place in Switzerland, evokes several of the main details from Senoncourt's work. Liszt also describes Obermann as the monochord of the relentless solitude of human pain, but at the same time the book that soothes my sufferings. The prevailing pessimistic mood is encapsulated by the first two quotations from Obermann that Liszt chose as a preface to the score. For instance, "What do I want? What am I? What should I ask of nature? I feel I exist in order to be consumed by ungovernable desires. All the needs and deep sorrows that a mortal heart can hold, I felt, I suffered. I swallowed up 10 years of my life." And the third epigraph that Liszt provides, taken from Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, amplifies the pessimistic mood with poetic poignancy. "I live and die unheard, with a most voiceless thought, sheathing it as a sword." Incidentally, the valley in the title can refer both to a geographical feature and a psychological state. In Letter 7 of Senoncourt's Obermann, we find this illuminating comparison between the valley and the mountain. The dweller in the valley devours without enjoyment his shaved and restless span of life, like those unresting insects that waste their energies in idly darting to and fro. Whereas in mountain solitudes, where the sky is vast, the air calmer, the flight of time less hurried, and life more permanent, all nature expresses a nobler plan, a more evident harmony, and eternal wholeness. In this way, a valley is both literally and metaphorically a depression. This is probably why Liszt was so unhappy with the idyllic illustration that accompanies the piece in the first edition. It conveys nothing of the abysmal valley inside a tortured soul. Compared with the revised version, the first version of Vallée d'Obermann from Album d'un Voyageur is more clearly cast in a monothematic sonata form with a rhapsodic introduction based on the first three notes of the main theme. In the revised version, Liszt departs from the sonata form, most notably by omitting the return of the main theme in the tonic E minor. The introduction is also removed, so we begin right away with the main theme. The entire piece is permeated by materials derived from this single theme, which seems to be crafted to sound as cheerless as possible. The final version is simply marked espressivo, but the original version gives a better clue to the character of the theme, with a profound feeling of sadness. It's also noteworthy that this theme bears some resemblance to the main theme from the first movement of Weber's Piano Sonata in E minor. According to Julius Benedict, who studied with Weber himself, the movement is supposed to portray the state of a sufferer from fixed melancholy and despondency, with occasional glimpses of hope, which are, however, always darkened and crushed. The parallels with Vallée d'Obermann should be obvious. The theme is made up of three motives. Motive A is a brooding descending line presented in a dark, low register. This is followed by Motive B, an appoggiatura that suggests the sighing of a troubled mind. Motive C connects these two motives, and this motive itself may be an allusion to Schubert's song Der Wanderer, which Liszt transcribed for the piano around the time he was working on the first version of Vallée d'Obermann. The motive corresponds to the words "Wo bist du?" Where are you? In the lyrics, referring to the happy place, whether real or metaphorical, that can never be found no matter how long and hard you look for it. Note also the appoggiatura creating the striking momentary augmented triad. Liszt also makes expressive use of this sonority, most notably at the end of Vallée d'Obermann. Harmonically, too, the music conveys profound soul-searching. A comparison with the original version brings the disorienting harmonic waywardness of the final version into relief. First, there is no bass E to provide any tonic anchoring. Incidentally, in the original version, you can see that motive B occurs at two different levels. Rather than the conventional move to the relative major in the first version, we now get a chromatic third relation to G minor with poignant chromatic inflections. The first four measures are then transposed up a minor third, which means that we end up in B-flat minor by measure 8, even though the tonic E minor was never firmly established in the first place. The tonal ambiguity and harmonic volatility of these opening measures seem appropriate for depicting the debilitating self-doubt expressed in the first epigraph. What do I want? What am I? The original version presents an uninterrupted flow of music from main theme to transition to subordinate theme. The final version, however, features a starker, more desolate texture that is plagued by frequent pauses, evoking the hesitation and indecision of a restless and weary mind. So it's not clear where the transition begins because everything feels transitory. We could, however, analyze the first thematic area in 4 phrases, which are presented, then immediately restated in the same order. We already looked at the first phrase. The second phrase expands motive C. And the third phrase mainly develops motives A and B, building up in texture and volume and culminating in a long falling line that suggests a veil of misery. Meanwhile, if we zoom out slightly, we can see that the bass has been descending gradually but inexorably from the end of the first phrase until the strong arrival of the B in measure 20, giving an underlying linear logic to the passage despite the harmonic instability. The stepwise descent of the bass line continues in the fourth phrase, while the treble line features motive C, groping for answers but finding none. The suspensions in measure 27 and measure 30 produce a striking augmented sonority that foreshadows the end of the piece. Then all 4 phrases are restated in the same order, but not in exactly the same way. For example, the first phrase now begins with better tonic definition. And the third phrase is transformed into an unexpectedly tender major mode oasis, providing a brief moment of respite. After the fourth phrase, there is an additional concluding phrase that gives the first unambiguous tonic chord in root position in measure 67. Motive A, the descending line from the theme, is stated 3 times, each time in a lower register. The third statement in the deep bass, marked pesante, seems to evoke the deepest valley. And it is precisely from this vantage point that the contrast with the sublime heights of the surrounding mountains can be fully appreciated. That is, in comparison with the ponderous E minor chords that immediately preceded, the subordinate theme in C major appears almost impossibly light and delicate. Of course, the subordinate theme is really a transformation of the main theme, starting with the descending line but becoming more disjunct towards the end of the phrase. Or you could perhaps understand it as essentially one long descent. When the theme modulates to bright A major, there is a sense of blissfulness and wonder that will unfortunately prove short-lived. The ensuing dialogue between soprano and bass grows impassioned and agitated as the voices pull apart towards registral extremes. This passage perhaps depicts the ungovernable desires that Obermann describes. And such desires lead to suffering. Ultimately, what remains is the forsaken bass line, plunging into the abyss. In the first version, the introduction already prefigures the recitativo or development section that follows. But in the final version, we have no prior inkling of the torrent of strong emotions that is unleashed here. The tremolos are crucial for creating the restless, stormy character of this section. Up to this point, the music could probably be played by a competent amateur, but suddenly the score turns black with notes, and the sense of physical struggle in tackling the technical demands of this section reflects the psychological turmoil of the protagonist. Interestingly, the tremolos in the first version were even more difficult to play, and they were designed to generate a powerful rumbling right away. The section culminates in urgent diminished seventh outbursts like the cries of a drowning man, barely audible in the tempestuous waves. The diminished seventh harmony is then stretched out into a long nightmarish scream. All this turbulence eventually exhausts itself in the F minor chord in measure 160. The transitional passage that follows is based on the first three notes of motive A, presented as a lonely voice in the treble that is answered by an implacable harmonization in the bass. Finally, the treble voice breaks out into a heartfelt quasi-cadenza that ends with the vobisdo motive, posing this most searching of questions once again. And at last, we appear to find some solace as the subordinate theme returns in E major. The starting pitches of the melody provide a more positive reinterpretation of the lonely treble voice in the preceding transitional passage. That is, becomes in measure 180, the theme is transformed once again, inverted to give a more optimistic rising line. By the way, the preceding measure may be offering another allusion to Schubert's Der Wanderer, corresponding with the words wo immer wo, which again highlights the search for the elusive happy place. The theme becomes more animated as the texture thickens from measure 188 onwards. In the original version, the texture perhaps became so thick as to sound muddy, especially with the closely spaced pounding chords in the bass. as we reach the coda in measure 208, the music builds to triple forte, becoming agitated as all sorts of foreign elements like common tone dominance and diminished seventh, as well as Neapolitan harmonies, threaten to undermine the apotheosis of the theme in the tonic major. If the piece were to end with the rising octave arpeggio in measure 214, this would be the kind of glorious, triumphant conclusion that would bring an audience to its feet. But Liszt gives us two more measures that cast doubt on all the progress that has been made. And motive C, the Vobisdu allusion, concludes the piece, tinging the final E major chord with a momentary augmented quality that gives it a bittersweet ambivalence. It's interesting to note that as an old man, Liszt refused to hear Vallée d'Obermann in its entirety. He apparently told one of his students to conclude performances of the piece at measure 74, which is kind of like leaving the listener stuck forever in the deepest, darkest valley.
Thanks for watching.